What does Wesleyan theology have to offer emerging forms of worship today? Should a Methodist or Wesleyan contemporary worship service look different than the Baptist service down the road, for example? I want to suggest that we have several unique things in our Wesleyan heritage that we can draw from that could renew church, the worship of the church today. Going all the way back to Wesley, we see in his final days, he edits a version of the Book of Common Prayer and sends it to the American Methodist. And he advises them to celebrate the Lord's Supper every week. In the same letter, he actually advises them to pray extemporaneously at other times. So from the very beginning, you have this heritage of form and freedom, two sides of the same coin. Now, as many of you know, the Sunday service of the Methodists in North America didn't last very long. As Bishop Nolan Harmon once put it, the circuit riders' saddlebags were too full to carry another book. And so that was shelved very early on for other more non-texted forms of worship. But this heritage of form and freedom has stuck with us. On the freedom end of the spectrum, early American Methodists still had a vibrant Eucharistic piety. They gathered regularly in these quarterly meetings where the Lord's Supper would have been kind of the climactic feature there. And of course, as many of us know, those worship times were marked with exuberance of people shouting. There's a reason why our Methodists were known as the shouting Methodist. Freedom factored heavily into that, and the heart factored heavily into that. But form never entirely left Methodists. The Methodists edited this version of the Book of Common Prayer and put it into the discipline in a little section called the ritual. And for hundreds of years, as Methodists made changes to their worship, they went back to the ritual, which has its link to the Sunday service of the Methodists in North America. As you look at the sweep of Methodist worship history, I think there's several things that are common that we can highlight. In the first place, as we've already talked about, Methodist worship has always had a desire to be rooted in something beyond the moment. Whether it's looking at the ritual and its link to the Book of Common Prayer, or certainly the Wesleyan hymns, we look back to text, hymns beyond our own moment to guide our worship. Secondly, we have this ethos of the personal aspect of worship. Methodists value that the person mattered. Just as salvation was available to all, just as salvation could be experienced by all, in worship, the person was valued. And the heart is an arena where God's Spirit works. But it's not just willy-nilly, it's tethered, it's rooted in something. So personal and rooted. And then lastly, we note in Methodist worship an emphasis on sanctification. Put quite frankly, worship ought to do something to the participant. It ought to transform us into the image of God, increase our love for God and our love for neighbor. Throughout Methodist worship history, you've seen various emphases on these, but it's nevertheless been a common strain throughout the history of Methodism. I'm convinced that in this day of increasing new forms of worship, we have a resource to look back on, to be grounded in, that values the emotions just as much as the mind, that values the past just as much as the need to be contextual in worship. And I think Methodists and Wesleyans have a great resource to offer to the church in our liturgical heritage.